Karoline Leavitt had been to countless ceremonies, White House briefings, campaign rallies, even foreign summits. But this one felt different. She adjusted the small silver cross at her collar as her plane descended into Rome. It wasn't official business. There was no press, no entourage. This was personal. The Vatican had announced the formal inauguration of the new pope, Pope Clement VII, a reformist voice who, despite claims of humility, had not once acknowledged the millions of American Catholics who supported traditional values. Karoline, a devout believer, had hoped for at least a nod. She wasn't naive. She didn't expect applause or invitation. But she wasn't prepared for the total silence either. Just weeks earlier, she'd written a personal letter, hand-signed and delivered through diplomatic channels, requesting a moment of prayer during the ceremony. Not a speech, not a photo, just prayer. She received no reply. Now, as the plane touched down at Fiumicino Airport, Emma, her longtime aide, leaned over with a furrowed brow. "Karoline, I just got word they've denied access to the inner courtyard. You'll be seated with general foreign delegates, no microphone, no prayer slot." Karoline exhaled slowly. "I figured as much." "You still want to go?" Emma asked gently. Karoline nodded. "If the Vatican won't give me a voice, then God will." They arrived at St. Peter's Square early the next morning. The marble shimmered in the sunlight. The crowd was massive. Diplomats, priests, media, and thousands of pilgrims. But Karoline wasn't treated as an honored guest. She was ushered into the far-right wing. Rows behind European officials, past dignitaries she'd debated in Brussels, beside ambassadors who barely masked their sneers. No one looked her way, not even the cardinals. She didn't belong in their ceremony, and they made sure she knew it. But Karoline didn't come to be seen. She came to witness, and, if the moment allowed, to be heard anyway. As the new pope stepped out onto the balcony, the square fell into reverent silence. Bells rang, cameras flashed, and Karoline bowed her head, not out of obedience to the pope, but out of loyalty to the one above them all. Pope Clement VII's voice echoed over the square, measured, academic, distant. His first message as pontiff focused on climate stewardship, migration reform, and global equity. But for millions watching, something was missing. No mention of faith under fire, no acknowledgement of persecuted Christians, and not a word about the American faithful. Karoline sat still, hands folded, the silver cross at her collar catching the morning light. Around her, foreign dignitaries whispered, translated, nodded in approval. But her silence wasn't apathy. It was disappointment wrapped in resolve. Emma leaned in. "They're passing out final speaking slips. You sure you don't want to make another push?" Karoline glanced sideways at the Vatican official walking down the aisle with a clipboard. She saw her name wasn't on it. "I won't beg," she said softly. "He may be pope, but he doesn't get to tell me when or how I pray." Suddenly, a flash of movement caught her eye. A group of teenage pilgrims, likely from Argentina, stood nearby, phones in hand. One pointed. "That's her. That's Karoline Leavitt." She offered a polite smile and nod, but they didn't just want a selfie. They wanted to hear her speak. But how? Later, as the Pope finished his address and the crowd began to stir, Karoline stood up, not on a podium, not with a microphone, but with purpose. She climbed 2 steps up the marble side tier, turned to the crowd, and raised her voice, not shouting, but clear. "If no one will speak about the faithful, then I will. If the cross is inconvenient to power, then I'll wear it louder." The surrounding row of dignitaries froze. Cameras hesitated. Even the Argentinian teenagers stopped scrolling. And then she began to pray. Not theatrically, not politically. Just a heartfelt, steady, defiant prayer in the middle of the most scripted moment on earth. "Lord, for those who've been cast aside, for those whose voices are unwelcome at sacred tables, may your truth, not their titles, define who leads." A hush swept the square. Even the Vatican guards stood still. The loudspeakers had gone quiet. But Karoline's voice, raw, real, cut through the silence. Some gasped. Some bowed their heads. And some, far away, watching through phones or news feeds, began recording what would soon become a spark for millions. By the time Karoline stepped down from the marble steps, the atmosphere in the Vatican courtyard had changed. The ceremony had officially concluded. The new pope had retreated into the apostolic palace, flanked by crimson-robed advisors. The Swiss Guard resumed their formation, but whispers lingered, none of them about him. They were all about her. She just prayed out loud. She wasn't even on the schedule. Did anyone stop her? Emma appeared beside her, breathless. "Karoline, it's already online." Karoline blinked. "What is?" Emma held up her phone. There it was, an unedited video, shaky but clear, posted by a teenager from the far wing. She wasn't on the mic, but we heard her anyway. Prayer in the square, 47,000 views and climbing, by the minute. Karoline tried to respond, but a middle-aged priest stepped forward. "Miss Leavitt," he said with a gentle Italian accent, "you reminded us who the church is supposed to serve." She looked at him surprised. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." He smiled faintly. "Then you succeeded in the holiest way." Hours later, back at the hotel, Karoline sat on the edge of her bed scrolling in silence. Her prayer had been translated into 12 languages. The hashtags varied, some calling her brave, others reckless. But one thing was clear. She had broken through the wall of Vatican decorum, and she hadn't needed permission to do it. Emma walked in holding her laptop. "You've got to see this." On the screen was a video posted by a Nigerian bishop. "When Karoline Leavitt prayed today, I felt more heard than I have in a decade." Then another from Poland. "The American girl with the silver cross reminded us what the church forgot." Karoline put her hand to her face, not in embarrassment but in awe. She had walked into St. Peter's Square with no mic, no schedule, and no welcome. But somehow she'd left with the entire world listening. And it was only the beginning. The next morning, Karoline awoke to the sound of notifications piling onto her phone like rainfall on a tin roof. Emma stood by the window, already dressed, with a half-serious, half-stressed look on her face. "They're not just reacting," she said. "They're coming for you." Karoline sat up. "Who?" Emma handed over the tablet. Headlines screamed across the screen. "Unauthorized prayer sparks Vatican controversy." Reuters, "American Politico hijacks holy moment." Le Monde, "Who gave Karoline Leavitt permission?" BBC. The final one stung, not because of its content, but because of its core assumption. Permission. She hadn't asked for it, and now they were furious that she didn't. Vatican spokesperson Father Antonio held a press conference that afternoon. Behind polished oak and bulletproof glass, he delivered the church's official stance. The events following Pope Clement VII's inaugural address were unscheduled and unendorsed. While we respect expressions of faith, proper protocol exists to preserve sanctity. A reporter interrupted. "Was Miss Leavitt's prayer disruptive?" Father Antonio paused, then answered flatly. "It was unexpected. Not disruptive, but not welcome. It was the most diplomatic rejection she could receive, and yet the global reaction only intensified. While some bishops echoed the Vatican's disapproval, others took to social media with very different tones. The Lord moves even when the stage says stop. The Holy Spirit doesn't wait for a microphone. In Texas, a church youth group reenacted her prayer for a viral TikTok. In Hungary, a conservative blog declared, "Leavitt has done more with 10 words than 1,000 bishops in a decade." But perhaps the sharpest response came from a CNN panel back home. A guest scoffed, "She's not Joan of Arc. She's a political staffer playing saint." Karoline, watching from her room in Rome, didn't flinch. She turned to Emma. "If they think I prayed for them, they misunderstood everything." Emma nodded. "Then who did you pray for?" Karoline looked out at the sunrise glowing beyond the Vatican dome. "The ones no one else sees." Karoline didn't pack in a hurry. She took her time, folding each item neatly into her suitcase. The silver cross stayed on her collar, not because she wanted to make a statement, but because she always wore it. Emma zipped up the final bag. "The car's downstairs." Karoline nodded and took one last glance at the Vatican through the window. The dome looked smaller than it had 3 days ago. Maybe because her view had changed, or maybe because it was never as large as the silence it once represented. At the airport, a young Italian customs officer recognized her immediately. Instead of checking her documents, he whispered, "You reminded my grandmother of the old church. The one with backbone." Karoline smiled. "Tell her the church never left. It just needed a voice." Back on American soil, the world hadn't calmed. Her brief prayer had sparked something deeper than debate. It had revived a dormant conversation about what faith looked like in a time of political polish and institutional fear. One major pastor in Ohio said on live stream, "She stood where most would have bowed. That's courage." Meanwhile, religious scholars debated whether she had crossed a sacred line or redrawn it entirely. And in New York City, an op-ed hit the morning papers. The Pope gave a speech. Karoline gave a sermon. Karoline returned to Washington, D.C. as quietly as she left. No rallies, no press tour. But when she stepped into her office, a stack of letters awaited. Hundreds of them, handwritten, folded, stamped with trembling signatures. One read, "I haven't stepped into a church in 12 years, but your prayer, it woke something up." Another, from a woman in rural Kenya. "The church forgot us. You reminded them." Emma stood silently, watching her read. "You didn't just speak, Karoline. You stirred something." Karoline folded the letter and looked out the window. "Then it's not about what I said. It's about what they felt." 3 days after Karoline returned from Rome, a sealed letter arrived at her office. The envelope bore no return address, just the gold crest of the Holy See. She opened it slowly, sensing it wasn't going to be a thank you. Inside was a short typed message in formal Vatican Latin, translated into English at the bottom. "While we acknowledge your personal expression of faith, we urge you to refrain from further public interpretation of Catholic teaching without ecclesiastical guidance." Karoline read the sentence twice, not condemnation, but a clear warning. Emma looked up. "They're telling you to back off." Karoline didn't blink. Then they should have spoken up when it mattered. That afternoon, a cardinal from Chicago gave a press statement calling Karoline's moment in Rome well-intentioned but improper. Another bishop suggested she was confusing youthful conviction with divine authority. Cable news panels latched on quickly. One host said, "She's building a movement on a moment. That's not theology. It's branding." But something unexpected happened. The backlash made her louder. A major Christian podcast invited her for an hour-long episode. She accepted, but never once mentioned the Pope or the Vatican by name. Instead, she said this: "You can silence a microphone, you can deny a podium, but you can't unhear a prayer." Within hours, the line was trending under #VoiceWithoutPermission. At the same time, small churches across the world began holding prayer breaks in honor of her stand. 5-minute moments of unscheduled reflection in defiance of formality. From Argentina to Appalachia, the phrase "she prayed anyway" became a quiet rebellion. But it wasn't just worshippers who were watching. Politicians began asking, subtly, carefully, could she be more than a spokesperson? Donors sent feelers. TV shows sent offers. Publishers reached out. But Karoline stayed grounded. "I didn't kneel for a brand," she told Emma. "I kneeled because someone had to." Emma replied, "And now they don't know how to stand up against you." The Vatican wasn't the only place feeling heat. In Washington, a private dinner convened at the Georgetown residence of a senior U.S. cardinal. The guest list included political advisors, 2 senators, and a White House faith liaison. The conversation circled one name: Karoline Leavitt. "She's unpredictable," one bishop murmured. "She's magnetic," said a senator. "She's getting bigger than her title," someone else added. The room fell quiet. Then a political strategist spoke. "If she becomes the voice of religious populism, We lose control over the message. Heads nodded. Solutions were discussed. Maybe a quiet meeting with the Vatican to cool her momentum. Maybe a press push to remind the world she wasn't ordained, not elected, and not authorized. Or maybe it was time to offer her something too big to refuse. Meanwhile, Karoline was unaware of the whispers, but not blind to the signs. An invitation to speak at a university faith forum suddenly vanished. A former ally at a Catholic foundation paused their public support. Even a conservative news anchor who once praised her began questioning if she was exploiting the moment. Emma brought it all to her desk in a folder labeled Shift. Karoline flipped through the papers and sighed. So they're circling the wagons. Emma nodded. They're nervous. Karoline stared out the window. They should be. That weekend, she traveled to a small church in Oklahoma where she'd been invited. Quietly, without media. No grand audience. Just a few hundred people, worn pews, and candlelight. At the end of the sermon, the local pastor stepped aside and whispered, "If you have anything to say, now's the moment. There's no camera, but every ear is open." Karoline stood slowly, walked to the altar, and said, "They told me to stop praying out loud, so tonight I'll pray louder in silence." And the room, hundreds strong, fell into the deepest stillness. No tweets, no clips, just presence, just power, just faith. A manila envelope arrived at Karoline's D.C. office on a Wednesday morning. No return address, but the seal on the flap was unmistakable. It was from the Ecclesia Institute, a powerful Vatican-affiliated council known for shaping international religious policy. Inside was a single sheet of premium ivory stock bordered in gold. Emma read it first, her brow tightening. It's an invitation. Karoline took it slowly, reading the line out loud. "We invite Miss Karoline Leavitt to join the Global Council on Faith Communications as a junior liaison and spiritual media advisor." Emma looked up. "That's their way of bringing you in." "And reining me in," Karoline replied. The letter praised her passionate articulation of traditional values, but also emphasized the importance of message alignment within the global Catholic community. Then came the quiet threat dressed as flattery. "Your voice has become too significant to remain independent." Karoline folded the paper and set it on the desk. Later that afternoon, she walked alone through the National Basilica in D.C. The sanctuary was quiet, sunbeams spilling through stained glass. A small group of schoolchildren walked past, whispering when they saw her. "That's her," one murmured. "She's the one who prayed in Rome." Karoline knelt in the last pew. No cameras, no advisors, just her and the one who never asked her to fit in. Back at the office, Emma was fielding calls from news outlets, podcast hosts, and even a streaming network interested in producing a docuseries titled The Silver Cross. But Karoline wasn't interested in being the story. She wanted to change the story. That night, she took a blank piece of paper and wrote 2 columns: compromise on one side, conviction on the other, under compromise, prestige, safety, controlled access, under conviction, risk, rejection, legacy. She stared at the list in silence. Then slowly, without a word, she crumpled the invitation from the Vatican and tossed it into the fireplace. Emma said nothing. She just nodded. "You just made your choice," she whispered. Karoline didn't look up. Number I just made space for something bigger. The morning after her silent live stream, Karoline Leavitt stepped into her office at the White House with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. The cross around her neck glinted in the sunlight pouring through the blinds. Emma stood by the desk, holding a stack of printouts. "Rome's watching," she said without greeting. Karoline arched an eyebrow. "I figured." Emma spread the pages across the desk. International headlines, thousands of X reposts, TikTok edits layering her prayer with music, even reaction videos from young Catholics and Protestants alike. They're calling it the prayer heard around the world, Emma said softly. One headline from a Paris outlet read, Une jeune Américaine fait trembler le Vatican. An American girl shakes the Vatican. In the Philippines, a bishop publicly praised her courage. In Brazil, a crowd gathered in front of a cathedral and recited her words aloud. In Nigeria, a small village played her voice on loudspeakers during morning mass. The message had transcended borders, but not everyone was pleased. The Vatican released a brief, cold statement. Ms. Leavitt does not speak for the Church. Personal expressions of faith, though respected, must not be mistaken for theological authority. Karoline read it and smiled faintly. That's not a denial, she said. It's fear dressed in robes. Emma lowered her voice. They're scrambling. Your prayer is outpacing their pulpit. That evening, Karoline stood at the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool. Not for a speech, not for a rally. She didn't even tell the press. Still, people came. Thousands. Word had spread online through a single post tagged, # she prayed anyway. There were no lights, no chants, no stage, just individuals kneeling, whispering, crying, sitting in silence. A quiet wave of faith, raw, untamed, and leaderless, yet undeniably sparked by her. A veteran approached her, hat in hand. You reminded me I'm allowed to believe again. A young Muslim girl placed a note in her palm. You gave voice to all of us they tell to stay silent. Karoline didn't speak. She just bowed her head again. At that very moment, thousands of miles away, Pope Clement VII sat at a grand table in the Apostolic Palace. Around him, his most trusted cardinals argued, debated, and dissected her words. But the Pope wasn't speaking. He held a small paper, a transcript of Karoline's live stream. His finger rested on one line she had whispered, If your faith depends on a microphone, it was never alive to begin with. He stood, placed the paper down, and walked to the balcony. He didn't speak. He didn't wave. He just looked out at the silent night over St. Peter's Square and whispered something only the wind could carry. Perhaps she was praying for me. It began with one post. Karoline, alone in her White House office, typed a simple message on X. This Sunday, wherever you are, kneel, whisper, or raise your hands. No stage, no script, just pray. Unfiltered faith. No time, no place, no movement. Just a call to pause. Within 24 hours, millions had seen it. By the end of the week, it was the top trend in 6 continents. The media didn't know how to cover it. It wasn't a protest, a political statement, or even a formal event. There was no leader, and yet everyone knew who sparked it. At sunrise on Sunday, in 100 cities, something extraordinary happened. In Times Square, traffic slowed as a spontaneous circle of people held hands and recited prayers in dozens of languages. In Paris, worshippers spilled out of churches and dropped to their knees in the streets. In a refugee camp in northern Syria, a mother lit a single candle and played Karoline's original prayer on a crackling speaker. Her children bowed their heads. In Tokyo, in Berlin, in Nairobi, in Buenos Aires, parks, plazas, cafes, and courtyards fell into silence. No one shouted, no one instructed. They just prayed. And on the balcony of the Vatican, for the first time in years, Pope Clement VII appeared without his usual address. Instead of speaking, he stood silently, watching the square fill with people, some with signs reading, "She prayed anyway," others simply holding rosaries, Qurans, or handwritten notes. A boy in the front whispered his own prayer into the air. Aides-de-camp rushed to offer the Pope a microphone. He waved them off. "Not today," he said. "Today belongs to something older than us all." Back in D.C., Karoline stood again at the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool. This time, the space was packed, overflowing. But there was no stage, no camera crew, no flag behind her. She didn't walk to a podium. She sat on the ground. In front of her, people of all races, religions, backgrounds, former critics, devout believers, curious skeptics. children holding candles. Karoline raised no hand. She held no script. She simply whispered, "Thank you for remembering what they tried to make us forget." The crowd followed her lead. A wave of stillness washed over them. Emma, standing to the side, had tears in her eyes. "I don't think we'll ever be the same," she whispered. That night, Karoline returned to her office, sat at her desk, and opened a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single page. It read, "We were wrong to ignore you. May your voice continue where ours once faltered. Clement." She folded it neatly and placed it in the drawer beside her original prayer notes. Above her desk hung a photo of St. Peter's Square, not the empty version from months before, but the one taken today, filled with people, not because of a decree, but because of a whisper. And in that whisper, a world rediscovered its voice. She didn't wear robes. She didn't hold a title. She didn't even have a microphone. But Karoline Leavitt stood where most stayed seated. She prayed when they told her not to. She spoke when silence was safer. And she reminded the world that faith doesn't need approval. It needs courage. From the Vatican steps to a quiet live stream, her voice echoed, not because it was loud, but because it was true. In a world that treats prayer like a performance, Karoline made it a rebellion, and in doing so, she didn't just defy the moment. She changed the story. This wasn't politics. It wasn't publicity. It was faith, raw, uninvited, unshakable. And now, that single prayer lives in the hearts of millions, as proof that you never needed a pulpit to be heard.